Thank you, Naim, and thanks to the audience for being with us on a very long day, and thanks to the organizers for making this event happen. Like you, when I looked at the title of the panel, my initial reaction was, well, this should end very quickly. I probably have very little to say. But we've organized the panel, and we've spent 2 days, obviously, debating some of these very broad general themes. I also feel a bit challenged, partly because I'm an economist who looks at particular processes that often are connected with security and political issues, but they have their own logic and their own underlying dynamics. Nonetheless, I've taken the question of the panel seriously. And I asked myself, like many of you, is there a roadmap ahead? Have I heard anything in the last 2 days or learned anything recently that suggests that, in fact, we can map the new architecture? And my first point is that, in fact, there is no roadmap ahead. That the process that one of our colleagues labeled yesterday, the disintegration of the regional order, which has been underway now for not just a few years. Some of us would argue that, in fact, it started probably decades ago. We have yet to see the end of it. We're unlikely to see the end of it anytime soon. So, state disintegration, disintegration of the regional order, state fragility, failure, collapse, and many of the schisms associated with it that have become almost normal in our lives. Civil strife, political polarization, economic dislocation. It seems, at least from a regional security, an expanded security perspective that includes the political and the economic, that the entire system is unraveling. If that is true, and I think a lot of indicators suggest that that is the case, that this process still has some way to go before it in fact settles. And until that point, mapping the new regional security architecture is still, I think, a task that will have to await circumstances, time, and a lot of uncertainty about what will happen between now and then. But there is another reason why I think we cannot map out the new security architecture beyond what's happening in the region. I don't think I'm the only one, and this should not come as a surprise to any of you, that the entire international order seems to be unraveling before our very eyes. And in fact, historically, at least the regional order that we have grown up with and have taken for granted goes back to the very inception of the current international system as it was given birth to sometime after World War II. So if you've got a regional order that's unraveling and an international order that is being tested, that is under stress, under threats, and could potentially witness a lot of realignment and a lot of reorderings of existing arrangements, then our own regional order, in fact, will have to, the realignment within has to take place as the international system realigns itself. And that's precisely what happened 70, 80 years ago. It wasn't an automatic process. It wasn't an overnight process. Some of you who probably are more familiar with the history of that time period will recall that it took decades for the regional system as we've known it, the state-centric system, to emerge. There was a lot of unpredictability. There were too many actors at play. There was a lot of international competition between powers that were on the decline, some colonial powers, and the new powers that emerged. And in fact, there was a lot of local competition as well, between tribes, regions, between Western educated elites, between Islamists, between seculars and liberals. So in my humble opinion, if you accept the first premise that the regional order as we've known it is slowly giving way to the emergence of another order, And if you believe that the international system itself is witnessing a realignment, then the two, in fact, will go hand in hand. This process will have to, we will be participants in this process. We can contribute to this process, but this process is not finished. In fact, in some cases, it's only begun. The second point I wanted to make, to only perhaps bring some balance to some of the discussions that has taken place in the last 2 days, is that it's not only the security architecture that requires fixing, requires mapping. It's also the economic architecture of this region, the economic arrangements that have been with us for a very long time, economic arrangements that have been failing, economic arrangements that have in fact highlighted the weaknesses of the state, and in my humble opinion, may have in fact exacerbated the process of state collapse in itself. Some of those issues that will have to be part of this economic realignment and restructuring have to deal with not just existing problems we've inherited. And in my own work in the last 10 years, and some of you is familiar with it, a lot of what violence and terrorism and youth has been about, it has been about economic exclusion, marginalization, disenfranchisement, the symptoms and causes and consequences of which have only gotten worse with time as they've been neglected. But we've got newer issues to deal with. We've got problems that we did not grow up with 20, 30 years ago. Inequality, mobility, economic security, problems that have to do with the basic provision of public services, education and health, that the collapsing state is no longer able to provide because the state's institutions are being hollowed out, they are being degraded, and they're unable to deliver. This also, as part of this economic restructuring, one of the consequences of it and why it is not just a small fix, but a larger problem, the entire conventional wisdom in the world, the so-called neoliberal economic order, is being questioned. In fact, it's in retreat as we speak. Deglobalization has suddenly become attractive. Deindustrialization is a problem. Markets are bad. The end of Davos man. Trump's rhetoric around populism in the West and others is feeding on a lot of economic insecurity, which is going to be part, in my view, of the larger security architecture of the region and the world. Final point, and I'll take 1 minute to
Thank you.
To try to sort of sum this up. Well, what do we do meanwhile? So if this process underway will still need time before it settles, and it's really not just about security arrangements, it's about a host of political arrangements, I would argue societal arrangements, a remaking of a system, so to speak. What do we do meanwhile, especially when we know that international actors will have a very important role to play in this? I think one thing we can do, and this came out of our discussion yesterday, was to try to contain the damage that's being done, not just to the security arrangements. I think this discussion is far beyond the states at the moment. It's about societies, it's about our locales, our villages, our towns, our sense of trust, relationships amongst neighbors. That's what's happening as states collapse in a lot of the countries where we've witnessed non-state actors emerge and civil wars escalate. But we can do more, perhaps, than just contain the damage. We can possibly anticipate the emerging new arrangements in the world. At the global level, at the regional level, we should anticipate those discussions. We should be part of the thinking. We should be part of the new narratives. We should be, in fact, acting to map out what is likely to emerge as the system produces new arrangements, new expectations. But we can, in fact, even do more than that. I think we need to speak about new visions for this region, new visions for our society, new visions for state-society relations, new visions for how sectarianism can be dealt with, how we bring about reconciliation, how we bring about national dialogue, how we engineer processes of reconstruction in the countries that have suffered a lot of damage. And I think as part of this, we have to go to some of the fault lines that have made themselves quite visible in our region in the last 5 to 10 years. The polarization, the sources of it, this schism between liberal and secular, between Sunni and Shia, the structural flaws in how our societies have coexisted with our societies and gradually undermined us and weakened us. We have to deal with these boldly, honestly, and we should avoid what happened 100 years ago when the regional system was put in place. We should not suppress our problems. We should deal with them up front. Suppressing our problems and pretending they don't exist only led to them fermenting, festering, as somebody indicated earlier, and them emerging eventually during moments of vulnerability and insecurity and state failure in the ugliest of forms. We should also, by way of thinking and avoiding historical mistakes, and this is the final comment from me, we should not outsource the reconstruction of our regional arrangements, the societal, the economic, and political. We should not outsource them to our elites. We did that 100 years ago. It produced arrangements that have worked, but it also established a lot of structural flaws that made it very difficult for us to reform, to fix, to bring about the renewal that was needed. The process needs to be much more inclusive, needs to be bottom-up, and it needs to include everyone that is concerned with the future that hopefully many of us will be a part of helping to establish the parameters for in the future.
Tarik, you know,